Now we're looking at Chapter 5 of Democracy and Media, focusing on the role of media in the democratization of Chile in the late 1980s. So to give you a brief recap of what we're going to be focusing on in the time frame. The early 1970s, a socialist president gets elected, and then very early on, General Augusto Pinochet, with the help of the US CIA, perform a coup d'etat, overthrow the democratically elected government, and institute a military regime. Now, we're not going to go too far down into it, other than to say this was an extremely repressive regime. Many people died. Many horrible things took place. Claims of genocide. International Criminal Court has gotten involved. Crimes against humanity allegations have been put out there. This was not a good time. What we will be focusing on, though, for it, is the role that media played in changing that toward democratization and the system that we have in Chile today. And specifically, we're going to start with the difference between alternative media and opposition media. We've talked about opposition media in other places before. Generally speaking, these media were illegal. Alternative media in Chile, though, were able to accomplish something we have not seen in other cases. And that is, number one, to become legal, and number two, to be able to put out a pro-democracy message. Think about that. You're in a military dictatorship, in an authoritarian regime, and you were able to convince the government that you can put out a pro-democracy multi-party message and be legal while doing it. How do you get to do this? Why is that opposition media, which did exist, were considered illegal, while alternative media were allowed to be legal? And it's the way they put their message out. Opposition media were anti-Pinochet. They were calling for the ousting of Pinochet. Alternative media were pro-multi-party democracy. See the subtle difference? Opposition media, anti-government. Alternative media, pro-democracy movement. They weren't calling for Augusto Pinochet to be thrown out of office. They weren't calling for another coup or a revolution. They were calling for an alternative. That's a huge difference. And because of that, linked with two other major things that we're about to talk about, alternative media had a massive effect on democratization in Chile moving forward. I'm only going to talk about the role of alternative media as far as its importance to democratization for a little bit, because it's very similar to what we've seen in other places around the world. So they struggled to keep freedom of expression alive, freedom of speech alive, freedom of media alive. It's one of the big things that alternative media did during the 1970s and 80s in Chile. What's more, though, is they gave potential politicians in the future a platform to speak to the people. So these new politicians that could theoretically be elected once democracy returns, they were introducing them to the population, even while still during an authoritarian regime. So that means when democracy would come, people would still know who these potential politicians are. Also, alternative media did a very important thing with keeping democracy and the culture of democracy alive in the people. As new people were being born into authoritarianism that never knew democracy, these people still had an opportunity to learn from their own people, from their own language, from their own media, what democracy means. So very important there. And then also introducing political themes and setting the agenda for the future when democracy does return. Choices that would have to be made. What kind of system is better, parliamentary or presidential? What kind of voting system is better, first past the post or proportional representation? You could have those kinds of conversations on alternative media, because as far as the Pinochet regime was concerned, that was just a conversation for down the road. Once again, alternative media were not calling for the ousting of Pinochet directly. So they were able to achieve a lot within an authoritarian regime. So we know alternative media were important in keeping the idea of democracy alive. But the author quickly mentions that the modernization of the communication network in Chile in the 70s and 80s, that without it, these effects might not have existed. That alternative media might not have played that huge of a role. Because in the 1970s, early 1970s, remember we said that leftist President Allende was elected, started implementing leftist socialist policies. When Pinochet took over with the help of the US, they brought in what was known as the Chicago Boys from the university systems, using their kind of economic theory to implement capitalism. All right, so what did they start doing? They started investing in infrastructure. They started investing in media networks. TV becomes the dominant medium. So visualize that. Now you can see people who are talking to you. They're connecting radio and television stations throughout the country, building roads to where newspapers can be delivered. The media market infrastructure boomed under authoritarianism. And even to the degree because they implemented a liberal economic policy of capitalism, private corporations were allowed, and advertising for these corporations were allowed. So this is huge. Alternative media corporations could actually be corporations rather than a small local business, and have their messages reach the entire country and be completely legal. That's a big deal. But what's more, the author argues that this inherently created a contradiction between the political system and the economic system. On one side, you had a free market economy based on the premise of freedom of choice of producer and consumer. And in the political system, you had no political freedoms, no political choice. You lived in an authoritarian regime. Put those two together, that's a huge contradiction that is in your face as citizens of Chile every single day. And that contradiction is important moving forward. Now, coming up in the mid to late 1980s, things are starting to change in Chile. And for the first time ever, we see two major events in an authoritarian regime in the country that the author argues changes everything that led to democratization. The first major event is that the Pope of the Catholic Church for the first time went visit Chile. Is this a big deal? Yes, it is. Chile, especially at the time, is a predominantly Catholic country. The leader of their church had never been there before. Religiosity in the country is extremely high. Put those things together, it's big news. What's more is that the Pope is on TV for the country to see. So even if you can't go physically see him, you still get to see the Pope, which is the leader, again, of your spiritual church. What's more is that you're seeing that the people who were allowed to meet the Pope were these potential political candidates that were on alternative media. And these individuals met the Pope, shook the Pope's hands, and the entire country saw this. And then Pinochet also decides at the same time to allow for a referendum, a yes-no vote. Do you want more of Pinochet authoritarianism, or do you want none of it? Well, I mean, that's a pretty big vote. You're asking the people within an authoritarian regime, do you want more authoritarianism? The answer, of course, should be no. But what do we know about elections in authoritarian regimes? They're generally not free and fair. All right? But the Pope, on national television, next to these potential Democratic candidates, says go vote. The Pope tells the country that Pinochet has guaranteed him that this will be a free and fair vote, and that Pinochet will listen to the results of the vote no matter what they are. The Pope is validating the election, the referendum. So is it a big deal that the leader of your church tells you to go vote and vote in a specific way? Very big deal. Very big deal indeed. Especially considering, as a repressive military authoritarian regime, you would probably be afraid to go vote against the regime. You would be afraid of reprisal, of arbitrary arrest, of kidnap, of being killed. So it is a big deal that the Pope said, go do this, and that it was on national television for everyone to see. The second big event that changed everything was the fact that there was a 30-day campaign, advertisement campaign, going into the election, where at 11 p.m. every night, pro-democracy movement gets 15 minutes, pro-military regime, pro-Pinochet movement gets 15 minutes. Now, why 11 p.m.? Remember, it's the 1980s, okay? The government figured, Pinochet figured, that no one was going to stay up till 11 p.m. to actually watch this advertisement. They were wrong. What's more is they figured 15 minutes, that's not really a big deal. Who cares if they get 15 minutes for 30 days straight? Once again, Pinochet was wrong. And Pinochet thought, wrongfully, that he had a lot of support. But think about it. You're a dictator. You're extremely repressive. You're not going to be surrounded by people that are going to tell you, oh no sir, you're going to lose this election. You're surrounded by yes people. As in, yes, you're okay, yes, don't worry about it, everything will be fine. What's more is that the pro-democracy advertisements for that 15 minutes for 30 days straight was extremely positive, whereas the government's was extremely negative. The pro-democracy movement was about the possibilities for the future and the change for good. The governments in the Pinochet regime was about negativism, scare tactics. Remember how horrible things were before, how horrible the economy was. What do we know about good versus bad? People like positive news to a certain degree. Negative news affects people in a negative way. In fact, it might even cause you not to vote. But the positive messages could cause you to vote, and vote in a pro-democracy path. And that's exactly what happened. The results ended up being about 56 to 44%. 56% in favor of getting rid of Pinochet. Now, by today's standards, that seems like a good margin of victory. But at this time, no, that's actually really, really close. Pinochet had 44%. 6 more percent, and he could have stayed in power. But Pinochet does respect the results, and he initiates a transition to democracy after the referendum. So let's put it all together. What affected the ability for the transition to democracy to take place in Chile? Well, one, you could definitely argue that without the Pinochet regime initiating the referendum itself, it would have not happened, or at least not at the time that it did. But let's say, okay, fine, but let's move forward. Pinochet regime did initiate the referendum. They thought they were going to win. So what happened that made them lose? Author says 3 major things. 1, modernization of the communication network, meaning nationalizing to where everyone can see the same thing. Number 2, contradiction between a free market and an unfree political system. Because people had a free market, they wanted a free political system. That contradiction doesn't rest well. That's why we don't really see many countries at all that have capitalism and authoritarianism, because of that contradiction. And the third one was the agenda setting of alternative media. And specifically, in the plebiscite campaign itself, how alternative media were able to frame the message of pro-democracy in a positive way. And that all of those things coming together really got out the vote to where authoritarianism and Pinochet ended in a democratic transition. Now, rather than going into it more, I'd rather really hear what you have to say about this in the forum. Do you think media, in this case, affected democratization and made Chile go from authoritarianism to democracy?